Okay, I think we'll take a start. If you can hear me. Okay, can you hear me? Okay. Yeah. Right. So, following my general introduction yesterday, where I hopefully set the scene for the unit. Today, I want to start off with this first specific topic area, which is agriculture. So, we're going to look at the environmental impacts of agriculture over these next 4 lectures. So, agricultural landscapes can look very different based on different modes of agriculture. This is an image of a typical British agricultural scene, cultivation of cattle, of livestock. Many people look at this and think, obviously, looks very natural, a very undisturbed scene. But of course, what we're seeing here is a very artificial landscape. The natural landscape of the British Isles before we introduced this form of agriculture did not look at all like this. It was predominantly forest land. But nevertheless, this does look like a fairly natural and biodiverse environment. Alternatively, cattle farming could look like this, very different, very much more intensive compared to the previous image. Arable agriculture, arable cultivation can also come in very different forms and can also be equally very intensive. So increasingly we're seeing this large farm, field size, very intensive, mechanised arable system where farm activities can take place day or night, depending on when the harvest needs to be made. Or it could look like this. This is cultivation of rice in Vietnam. Very different scenario. Obviously, this landscape is making use of these hillsides, but clearly a very artificial landscape. Indeed, so all these examples, there's a lot of artificiality in these landscapes, in the sense that we've changed the landscape, we've shaped the landscape for these agricultural requirements. So we've moved away from what was the previous natural, traditional landscape. So what we're going to cover in these lectures is looking at how our agricultural activities have changed our natural world over time, how it shaped our landscape, and how it's impacted on the organisms that are naturally present in these landscapes through various drivers of biotic change that is due to agriculture. So pollution such as nitrogen fertiliser runoff, chemical pesticide use and greenhouse gas emissions. Well, so we're going to go through different examples of these challenges that are caused by agriculture and what types of organisms are affected by these challenges. We're going to touch on ecosystem services that can benefit agriculture or might be challenged by agriculture. And then in the fourth lecture, we're going to look at the potential solutions that could overcome some of the environmental challenges that our modern agricultural systems give rise to. What are the potential sustainable solutions for agriculture moving forward? Because, of course, we have to realise that we need agricultural systems to feed and sustain our high populations. We have to accept that there are going to be impacts on our environment, on our biodiversity, but obviously we need to weigh up the need to provide food with these challenges. These are complex scenarios. It's not black or white. It's not simply that intensive agriculture is bad for biodiversity and avoiding these agricultural systems is good. It's more nuanced than that. And there's not a single simple solution to overcome some of these problems that I'm going to describe. So we're going to go through describing some of the drivers of environmental change that are caused by agricultural processes. And today we're going to focus on habitat losses, on the impacts of pesticides, and touch on genetically modified crops. So let's start by looking at where we are today with regard to agricultural land use. So these are three maps of the globe, and the top map that I've boxed is the profile of the natural vegetation state. Essentially, this is the kind of the baseline background of different vegetation types before substantial human intervention. So what we find that in the northern regions, we've got lots of boreal forest, temperate forest, moving down towards tropical forests in the tropics. We've got this band of grassland and scrublands and savanna, and then deserts near the equatorial regions. And then in these two maps below, we're showing you first the croplands. So these are the arable lands where we're cultivating our crops like wheat or rice, etc. And then this bottom graph is showing the pasture lands and the range lands where we're cultivating cattle and animals for various uses. We can see that these agricultural lands are covering about 40% of our planet's surface. And about a third of that is for the croplands, and about 2/3 for the pasture and rangelands. And by comparing these two maps with the upper natural vegetation map, we can start to see what sort of land use changes have taken place. So what we see that these croplands are very much overlaying with the areas that are typically the forests. So particularly some of these temperate forest lands up here. So what we can see is that a lot of these lands that were previously forests have been cleared to make way for these cultivation of these arable crops. And similarly, lots of these pasture areas and these rangelands are mapping onto the areas that were previously grasslands and shrublands and savannas. So these are sort of land use changes that have taken place over the last few centuries. And indeed there has been some substantial land use changes. So there's been substantial loss of forests and woodlands. So in the UK, which was, go back a few thousand years, was very much covered by forest. We're down to about 10% of forest cover that was originally in the UK. There's been a huge reduction in wetlands, which I'll come back to a bit later, due to land being drained for agriculture. And degradation of uplands. So not very far from here, in the peat district, a lot of peat uplands have been degraded through a combination of both industrial emissions, but also of agriculture, principally through sheep grazing. That's led to a lot of degradation of peatlands. And this major change in land use has led to loss of many animal types. So in the UK, we've lost a lot of large animals that were traditionally here, so we no longer have wolves roaming around this country. Boars and beavers became extinct, and actually only recently they've started to be reintroduced in some areas through rewilding activities. Also, large carnivorous birds like bustards and cranes have also largely disappeared. So we've lost a lot of these animals that are specialists for particular habitats, and we've increased the generalists, so that the plants, the animals that are quite happy to survive anywhere. And there's been substantial changes in plant communities in these areas. So what we're seeing is, as I described yesterday with regard to land use changes through urbanisation, where we get homogenisation of biota. Likewise, in agricultural systems, we're also seeing a homogenisation of biota and a reduction in biodiversity. So to understand where we currently are with agriculture, to understand how some of these challenges have developed, I'm just going to take you very quickly through a quick whistle-stop tour of the history of agriculture through our civilization. And of course, we have to go back to the Neolithic time, so when we moved away from being hunter-gatherers to starting to domesticate animals and plants, we started this change. We started to domesticate animals like those shown here, goats, pigs, cows, sheep, etc., both for their meat, but also for their milk. And one point I just want to make with this slide is that while a lot of the changes that I'm going to describe are impacts that we have had on other plants and animals, it's not been completely one way. There have been some examples, such as this one, where we have also undergone some change as well. So as we domesticated many of these milk-providing animals, we have also co-evolved to tolerate this consumption of milk. And what, interestingly, we find is that as we migrated into the northern areas of Europe, we took these animals with us, we started drinking milk provided from these animals, we gained an ability to tolerate milk, to tolerate lactose, which previously was the norm in our genotype to be lactose intolerant. And interesting, what we see today is that certainly in large parts of northern Europe, the majority of population, when we look at their genomes, are and also their characteristics, are more now lactose tolerant compared to populations towards the south of Europe are predominantly more lactose intolerant. So this domestication process has also given rise to changes in us. So focusing on domestication of plant crops, so about 10,000 years ago, this took place independently across the planet with a variety of plant species, as listed here in these different regions. Some regions were more successful than others. So this region here in Southwest Asia, often referred to as the Fertile Crescent, was particularly successful at domesticating a range of plants and animals. So particularly the cereals like wheat and barley were domesticated originally in this region, and then as populations moved into other parts of Europe and Asia, they took these domesticated plants and animals with them. What's also worth noting here is that these regions that were the cradles of this domestication were, at this time, the regions of intensive agriculture, are not the same regions that are the sites of intensive agriculture today. So, for example, there was, in this time, lots of agricultural activity going around in Central America and the north areas of South America, whereas today these are not as productive as they once were. Much greater productivity of arable cultivation in North America. Likewise, there's now much greater cultivation in areas of Northern Europe. So as people moved into other regions, they took these crops and enhanced the cultivation of these crops with them. Other activities that took place are other landmarks in agricultural development. So in the 18th century, people then started to develop processes to enhance agricultural yields. So people started to rotate crops. It was soon realised that if you're growing the same crop on the same area of land year on year, your yields will reduce year on year as the plants deplenish the nutrients from that field. So otherwise what people would do is leave that field fallow for a couple of seasons to allow that soil to recover its nutrients. But then people realised that, farmers realised you can rotate crops. So one year you may grow wheat, the next year you may grow a crop like clover, that because its nitrogen fixation is able to recover the nitrogen content in that soil, maybe then grow a different crop the following year, and then you can go back to, say, wheat 3 or 4 seasons hence. And in that way you're reducing the amount of fallow land that's left, and you're therefore increasing your agricultural productivity on your land. Also at this time we started seeing technological improvements, so introduction to ploughing machines, introduction and invention of machines for mechanical seeding, as well as starting to see selective breeding of cattle that were much more productive. This is also the time when we got these large-scale removal of wetlands. So many parts of East Anglia, so Norfolk, Suffolk, Cambridgeshire, a lot of these fenlands were drained to convert this land to arable land, where it was very productive. Increasingly, farmers would start to fertilise their soil in different means. Night soil, this is this euphemistic term for essentially human sewage that was collected at night. So these night soilmen would go into the cities at night, collect the human sewage, and then that would be put onto the farmer's field as a source of fertilisation. Guano, these bird droppings, were increasingly being imported into the country. So we were importing guano from some of our colonies in the Caribbean and elsewhere, which was then used as a readily available nutrient fertiliser for the crops. So because of this increase in agricultural productivity, we were able to give rise to increases in our human population. So I showed you this graph yesterday, and this increase in population in the 1800s was largely due to this ability to extend the agricultural productivity through these processes that I mentioned. And then more changes, more improvements in the 20th century. And this is when we start to see some inventions, some improvements that really have given rise to substantial agriculture improvements, but have also given rise to some of the challenges that we now see arising from agriculture. So one of these is the utilisation of ammonium-based fertiliser. This has really driven improvements in crop yield, but also has driven issues of pollution through to via eutrophic activities. So the invention of ammonium-based fertiliser, this was the Haber-Bosch process, invented by this guy Fritz Haber, and then modified and scaled up by Carl Bosch. So this is where we have nitrogen gas, hydrogen gas, that are under high temperature and high pressure, able to combine to generate ammonia. A very energy-intensive process, which obviously generates its own challenges when we're utilising and requiring so much ammonia-based fertiliser. This is also driving carbon inputs and driving greenhouse gas emissions. But nevertheless was a key landmark in 20th century agriculture improvement. Also, during the 20th century, we saw the invention of a number of different pesticides, notoriously DDT, this incredibly toxic chemical that started to be used in the late 30s and 40s. And the Green Revolution was this programme, this long-standing programme over a number of decades to give rise to the development of a number of high-yielding crops, which were not only used for domestic use in the USA, in Europe, but also, more importantly, this knowledge was transferred to other parts of the world, to South America, to Africa, to Asia. And then finally, genetically modified crops. These were invented in the 1980s and started to become used more widespread from the 1990s onwards. And these processes led to further improvements, substantial improvements in crop productivity, as shown here in these graphs. So, shown here from the 1960s onwards, we've had substantial continual rises in cereal yields due to increasing inputs of nitrogenous fertiliser and phosphate fertiliser, as well as improvements in irrigation of crops and increasing inputs of pesticides on these crops to control insect pests and to enhance productivity, so less of a crop is being lost through insect damage. growth is improved through the introduction of these fertilisers. Also, the crops are kept well watered. And this has really led to substantial improvements in agriculture, but without further expansion into land area. So the big land use changes were taking place in the 18th, 19th centuries, and then subsequent improvements have been through these more technological improvements. So much so that we now produce substantially more food per capita than we did in the middle of the last century, and arguably we are now more overfed than we were previously. In fact, we now see much greater proportions of population who are overweight or obese in compared to those that are underfed or even malnourished, certainly in Europe and in North America. And many people have argued that actually we're not facing a challenge of being able to produce enough food, but rather we have the challenge of poor distribution of this food that we produce globally. And that's an issue which we're not going to get into in this lecture course. And of course, finally, it's worth remembering that we're not purely growing these crops for human feed. There's a proportion of these crops that are used for animal feed, which are then giving us meat. And that in itself is an important point to note, that to generate a kilogram of, say, wheat grain versus a kilogram of beef, producing the meat requires much substantial greater resource in terms of water, in terms of nutrients, in terms of energy input in comparison to the grain. Also, there's needs for this crop production for a range of non-food uses. So it's easy to forget that a lot of these cosmetic products, industrial products, are plant-based. So there's a lot of demands on agricultural productivity. Okay, so for the next sort of half hour or so, I'm going to focus now on some of these ecosystem implications of this agricultural development. So we've now got to a situation where our agriculture is highly productive. We're using a lot of land. We're also using a lot of resources, a lot of fertiliser, chemicals, water. What are the implications of this? So we're going to look at some of these challenges of habitat loss, of pollution, and some of these other issues that have all impacted on biodiversity of a range of different classes of organism. So let's start with habitat loss. So as I said, there was certainly in Europe widespread clearance of forest land and grassland to generate these land to be used for cultivation of cattle and land for growing arable crops. But still today we are seeing large clearances of land, typically tropical forests in parts of Southeast Asia and parts of South America, to make way for agricultural productivity. And as most of you will know, this has been an issue in the news substantially this summer with regard to the widespread increase in the number of forest fires in the Amazon. And this is a map just showing the fires that have been shown to be started in the Amazon since this August. So substantial areas of land is being cleared, as shown here in this photo, to make way for more agricultural utilisation. We're constantly being told that trees have a key role in carbon sequestration. There's a lot of media attention recently of programmes that we're encouraging governments to develop to cultivate more trees, plant more trees for their carbon sequestration abilities. And there's been a number of scientific studies that have come out in the last 12 months that have been showing evidence-based that indeed these forests can have quite substantial abilities to sequester CO2. And yet we are losing substantial amounts of trees through land use due to agriculture. So it's been estimated about 16 billion trees are being cut down every year. And another estimate is that about 46%, there's been a 46% loss of trees since the onset of agriculture by human civilization. But it's not just the forests that are being degraded and being lost, but there's other habitats that are equally at threat. Grasslands, natural grasslands are at threat, as indeed are hedgerows and other forest verges. So as there's been a move towards greater mechanisation and intensification of agriculture, there's been a drive for larger fields, and so the removal of these field boundaries, so these natural hedgerows. So again, another classic image of a British countryside, but the loss of these hedgerows and the loss of these verges with the plant community diversity that they contain has been a big challenge. So much so that the International Union of Conservation of Nature have estimated that up to 5,000 or more than 5,000 species are at risk through agricultural activities. And this is both through direct loss of these natural habitats, but also due to the challenges to the species that live within the agricultural land themselves. So agricultural land, our arable fields, our cattle grazed grasslands, these are not completely bereft of biodiversity. Over centuries, that many organisms have adapted to live in these agricultural lands, and indeed many of these organisms play a key part in the function of these agricultural lands. And these organisms that live in these landscapes are referred to as the agro-biodiversity. Many of them play a key role in key ecosystem services for farming. So, for example, pollinators that play a key role in pollination of many of the crops that require insect-based pollination. Also, many soil microorganisms that play a key role in maintaining the fertility of agricultural soils. And yet these species have also been shown to be at risk through agricultural activities. So let's just touch on some of these. So wildflower population, arable weeds and wildflowers have been shown in a number of studies to be reduced in their abundance due to a combination of loss of these hedgerows and field margins, and due to increased use of herbicides. Obviously, farmers are using herbicides to control the weeds for their crops, but of course these herbicides are killing off many of these wild plants. And the knock-on effect of that is it's impacting on insect habitats. So many of the insects that are using these hedgerows and verges as a habitat are being impacted through this loss. In combination through equally increased use of pesticides. So increased use of broad spectrum insecticides, which I showed you in that previous graph over the last 50 or so years, has caused substantial declines in different insect populations. And it's typically the large natural predator insects, so things like the ladybirds, wasps, many classes of spiders, lacewings, etc., that are being directly impacted by these pesticides, in combination to the target pests that farmers are attempting to control on these crops. So here's some data with regard to pollinator insects. Now, as I said, these insects are playing a crucial role, both naturally in terms of mediated pollination, but also in terms of pollination for crops. And what this study clearly showed is that the abundance of these pollinators are markedly affected by the location of these habitats, these natural habitats, these natural grasslands and these field verges. So two metrics here. So the graph on the left is showing the richness of these pollinator species. And on the right here, this is a quantification of the number of times that the pollinator visits a flowering plant in the crop. And as we can quite clearly see, as we're moving further away from these habitats, we're getting a substantial decline in the number of visits that these pollinators are making to the crop plant flowers. And likewise, pollinator species richness is significantly declining as we move further away from these habitats. And it's not just loss of habitat, but as I say, it's the introduction, the widespread use of these insecticides, particularly the neonicotinoid class, that's playing a major impact on these pollinators. And there's been a lot of press over the last couple of years with the link with these use of these neonicotinoids and the impacts on bees and many of the population crashes that we're observing with bee species. Some of the evidence linking neonics to bee loss has initially been indirect, but a number of recent studies, such as this one published in Nature about 5 years ago, provide some more compelling evidence that there is indeed a direct link between the use of these chemicals and bee survival. So what they did in this study is they used oilseed rape plants. They added concentrations of neonicotinoids to the seeds at concentrations that are consistent to what is naturally seen in a crop that's sprayed with this insecticide. And here they've quantified both the density of wild bees that are then visiting the treated seed or the untreated control seed. And in this metric here, this is essentially quantifying the reproduction of the bees. And what we see here, this is substantially inhibited compared to the control. And as I say, these bees play a critical role in pollination services. And many of our key crops do rely on pollination. So many of the fruit crops, for example, pretty much all the fruit crops, do require pollination to develop. So much so that beekeepers in the US and indeed in Europe are now playing a key role in providing a service in renting out their bees to farmers when they require their crops to be pollinated. So, for example, in the US, in California, so a lot of beekeepers move down at the time when it's, for example, with the almond crop, when that is the time when it needs to be pollinated. The farmers ask that the beekeepers come in, they let their bees do their thing for a period of time, obviously at a cost, and then once the almond crop has been pollinated, they can move on to the next crop, such as peach or to the orange groves, and these beekeepers are earning more money from this pollination service than they are from selling the honey. Such is the need now for this artificial induced pollination of the crops because the natural pollinators are at such a significant decline. Further evidence of this link between this introduction of these insecticides and the bee population crashes comes from studies such as this one, published a couple of years ago, which showed substantial abundance of neonicotinoids in honey samples themselves. So worldwide, this study showed that in vast proportion, so 75% of the honey samples analysed, that there was presence of these neonicotinoids. So it's both impacting the life cycle of these insects, but it's also affecting the products. And in actually data like this, when we're saying, well, actually this product that we want to acquire from the bees is being contaminated by these insecticides, people do start taking more notice. And in fact, from last year, 3 of the main used neonicotinoids were banned for outside use in the EU. Although there's still many regions globally which are still using these insecticides quite widely. So as well as insects, there's also been substantial impacts on other animals. So a number of mammals, well, small mammals, have been affected by agricultural practice. So bats, obviously many bat species are insectivorous, are being showing reduced population densities. Animals like hares also declining. Although interestingly, many of the rodents, so like the voles and shrews, etc., are not showing clear evidence of reduction. Birds, however, have been substantially impacted by agricultural activities. And again, there's strong correlation that this is linked to insecticide use. And in some cases, for some species, there's been up to a 90% decline seen since the 1980s. And so, not surprisingly, for many of these bird species that are dependent on insect prey, as the insects are being affected by insecticide use, so are these bird populations. And there's a clear, significant correlation with the usage of these insecticides and the trend in these bird species abundance. And aquatic species, fish, amphibians, are also being affected through a combination of loss of habitat. So ponds, rivers are being either filled in or reduced in size due to increased agricultural land, as well as runoff through chemical input and nutrients into these waterways that are then toxic to these animals. And then finally, soil organisms. So these may not be considered as obviously, they're not as visually obvious as, say, the insects or the birds, but these soil organisms, so these soil bacteria, soil fungi, soil insects, and soil invertebrates, generally play a key role in agricultural soil fertility, both in providing nutrients, in maintaining the turnover of soil. And studies such as this have shown quite conclusively that the greater the intensity of agricultural practice, the greater the impact this has on soil biodiversity. So these graphs show just 3 different measures of soil biodiversity. You don't need to necessarily worry about exactly what these measures are, but what these graphs are showing for 4 different regions within Europe, at different levels of intensity of agriculture, there's a significant decline in the abundance of these soil microorganisms, going from a more low intensity agriculture, so these low intensity grasslands, to the more highly intensively managed intensive rotation fields. We're seeing substantial declines in the amount of soil biodiversity that are present at these sites. But it's not all a negative. In some situations, we find that some agricultural management can actually enhance some measures of biodiversity. So this is a study from Sweden, I think it was, where they looked at traditional grazing practices on grasslands, and they compared grasslands where there was no grazing activity that had taken place. And here they're quantifying the diversity of plant species in these grasslands compared to areas where there's some signs of natural grazing by wild animals, or sites where there was moderate to well grazing by domestic animals. And what you're seeing is a significant increase in the diversity of those plant species as there is moderate levels of grazing. And the conclusion here is, or the argument here is, that the animals are moving plant seeds across these areas. They're naturally fertilising this area through their droppings, and so adding some additional inputs to maintain and enhance the plant communities in these locations. But then if we do move to much more intensive mechanical agriculture, then we do then see again a drop in biodiversity. Abandonment of agricultural land can also, interestingly, impact on biodiversity. So where we have areas that are maybe moderately productive, but it's not economically viable to continue productivity, and if that area is then abandoned as an agricultural site, we find, interestingly, that plant and insect biodiversity is reduced. So this is data from, this is actually from sites in Japan, if I remember rightly, where the authors measured a range of different plant species and insect types. And what we have here is quantification of abandoned sites, shown here by the blue bars, traditional farm sites, shown by the green bars, and then intensive farmed sites, shown by the red bars. And what interestingly we find for many of these treatments is that the abandoned sites have a reduction in biodiversity compared to these traditional farmed locations. So I want to just finish by touching on this issue of genetically modified crops. And GM crops have had a pretty bad press from their environmental standpoint over, well, ever since they've been introduced. The likes of Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth, Soil Association, others are very against the intervention of GM crops. They think they're particularly damaging to the environment. But is this true? Is this the case? I think it's worth saying that I'm fairly positive towards genetically modified crops. I see a lot of potential benefits in this technology. However, I do agree that in some cases there have been either no good evidence has examined the full environmental challenges of these crops, or equally there are some clear evidence where they are damaging to the environment. But the question is, are they any more damaging than non-GM agriculture, which does equally give rise to environmental impacts? So GM crops are being quite substantially cultivated, as we can see in this graph here. So since their introduction in the mid-90s, year on year has been an increase in their cultivation by farmers across the globe. So much so that now we've got to a situation where about 200 million hectares of GM crop is being grown across the planet. So, and this is equivalent in both sort of industrialised countries, so particularly North America, but also in the so-called developing countries, so parts of South America, Africa, China, other parts of Asia. And these are mostly soybean, maize, cotton and canola. And most of these crops are for controlling weeds or for controlling insect pests. So the weed control, this is where these plants have been engineered to express a gene to allow them to tolerate a herbicide such as glyphosate. So when a farmer then sprays his field with this glyphosate, his crop will survive, but the surrounding weeds and any other plant that's growing in that location will be killed off. The insect-resistant crops have been engineered to contain an insect toxin. So this is typically these Bt toxins, which are derived from a specific class of bacterium, which are very toxic to different classes of insects. So if the insect then feeds on the plants containing this toxin, they will exhibit mortality. And then some of these traits are for other disease resistance, such as against fungal or bacterial pests, or some other non-disease characters, such as improved nutritional quality, such as the golden rice, or for drought tolerance. So what are the possible impacts of a genetically modified crop? Well, it's possible that the genetic change could affect the fitness of a plant. So the plant could be more invasive. It could be able to outcompete against an indigenous non-GM plant, potentially. It's possible that the genetic change could make the plant more toxic or change its interaction with any organism that interacts with that plant, such as an insect or any microorganism or animal in the soil. So these insect resistant plants or these herbicide resistant plants could potentially provide a selective pressure to gain resistance. So for example, with regard to the Bt crops, if they're being overused, it's possible that insects that are feeding on these plants but are not all exhibiting 100% mortality, some of these insects could evolve resistance to the toxin and therefore would become a potentially even greater pest. Likewise, when the farmers are quite substantially spraying their glyphosate on the crops, some of the weed species may gain resistance to the glyphosate. And in fact, we've seen in recent years, we've seen evidence that this indeed is the case. We are seeing insects that are gaining resistance to Bt, and we are seeing weed species that are gaining resistance to glyphosate. It's possible that any changed crop management through the cultivation of GM could affect other arable components, and I'll come back to that in a minute. It's possible that the GM farming practice could change cropping patterns, such as crop rotation patterns, and that could have other indirect impacts with biodiversity, potentially. And finally, it's possible that the GM crop, that the genetic change that has taken place, could potentially make it an altered host to a plant pathogen. So, for example, it's possible that the GM plant could more actively harbour a particular pathogen. Now, these are all hypothetical examples, or instances rather, which may or may not be true. And of course, it will depend on the genetic trait that is engineered in these particular plants. I just want to make one highlight with regard to this fourth point, with regard to potential changes in crop management strategy, with regard to the herbicide-tolerant, glyphosate-resistant plants. So, as these types of plants began to be introduced, such was their success in controlling weed species, farmers no longer had to rely on the more traditional methods to control weeds, such as tilling or ploughing. So they no longer had to frequently till their fields. This had potential benefits in terms of their saving energy, so they're not having to use their tractors as much in terms of ploughing their fields. It's also been shown that this had benefits to reducing soil erosion and also benefits to soil organisms that are otherwise being affected by soil impaction. So while there are clear challenges with the widespread use of this glyphosate, there's large amounts of chemicals being added onto these fields, and also there's clear evidence of gain of insecticide resistance. Clearly, there are some positives as well. So it's a complex issue. It's not black or white. And also, we've seen that through the introduction of these Bt crops, the farmers no longer have to utilise pesticides to control the insect pests. So there's been a significant decline in the use of these insecticides. And this has had other benefits. So a number of studies have been starting to see increased recovery population of other non-target insects, so things like the ladybirds, spiders, lacewings, that were otherwise being affected by the previous excessive use of pesticides. And then finally, I just want to make a mention on this particular concern of gene flow that's been a concern by a number of critics of GM technology. So what we mean by gene flow is we have a transgene that's been engineered into a genetically modified plant, and there's a risk that that gene could migrate from the GM plant into a non-GM plant. And of course this can happen quite easily because plants all the time distribute their genetic material via pollen. So as they spread their pollen, that is their genome being spread out into the environment from one plant to another. So this risk of gene flow is particularly a concern where there's a crop plant that has wild relatives in that vicinity that are able to be receptive to cross-fertilise from that pollen. So for certain classes of plant, it's a much greater risk, particularly where there are species where there's more likely to be compatible weedy relatives nearby, and also when there's a greater likelihood of outcrossing through via pollen. So it depends on, for example, whether pollen is mediated by the wind or by insects. So if it's by insects for a particular plant, pollen can be carried on on much greater distances. So plants such as these listed here, the brassicas, carrots, squash, etc., are more at risk for these factors because of both their fertilisation characteristics and the sorts of weedy relative plants that tend to live in these areas. This is a complex issue though. So while there is evidence that these sorts of gene flow events can happen, just because a pollen does cross-fertilise with a wild relative plant and can transfer a transgenic gene from a GM plant to a non-GM plant, it doesn't necessarily mean that that transgene will be selected for and retained within the wild relative. This is a process referred to as introgression, because there's got to then be additional selection pressure for that transgene to be retained within the wild relative. There's actually still a lot of research that needs to really fully understand what are the potential likelihoods and the risks of this occurring. And finally, I sort of end with this quote from the European Academy's Science Advisory Council. They published a report in 2013 where they analysed the potential challenges of GM technology, both to the environment and to health, and they concluded that with the current scientific evidence that there is no evidence that these crops have a greater adverse impact on health or the environment than any other plant breeding technology. And in fact, they feel that these technology could potentially contribute to sustainable development goals. So it comes back to this point where agriculture is damaging anyway. Whether GM technology is more damaging than the alternative agricultural systems is still open, but as yet the evidence is unclear. Okay, I will end it there. Here's some reference materials, some review articles and other reading which will allow you to have a bit more in-depth reading into these topic areas. And we'll continue on Thursday with part 2 of the agriculture topic, where we'll start looking at eutrophication and the risk of nitrogen pollution and others. Okay, I'll see you on Thursday. Yeah, absolutely. Well, what I did, I mentioned that the insects are particularly affected. I showed that insects were affected by both habitat loss and insecticides. I showed that birds were heavily affected indirectly through that loss of insects. I mentioned some classes of small mammals, it's also said that there's aquatic species such as fish, frogs, toads. They're all organisms. So organisms are animals and plants and birds. So that's a collective term for life.